I'm about to show you how to bake perfect sourdough bread at home, even if you've never done it before. After baking thousands of loaves and learning the hard way, I realized the best bread comes down to a simple step-by-step process that you can use to bake perfect loaves every single time. And it all starts with this. Let's start with what you need to make great sourdough bread at home. The first thing you're gonna need is a high protein bread flour. King Arthur, Central Milling, those are great brands, your store brand, whatever you have access to. But if you're a new baker, I highly recommend that you use a high protein bread flour. You're also gonna need some water. I'm using filtered water here, but you use what you have. You're gonna need some salt. This is my very favorite salt. It looks a little bit chunkier than what you would normally see. This is a gray French sea salt. It is so good. These salt crystals will completely dissolve in the bread, but I love the flavor. I'll link it down below for you in case you want to give it a try. It's my favorite. And then the most important thing that you're going to need to make sourdough bread is a really good sourdough starter. So you're going to need a starter that's healthy and active, that's doubling in size about 4 to 6 hours after feeding it, and one that doesn't smell really bad like nail polish remover, okay? So you want to make sure you have a good, healthy, and active sourdough starter. If you don't have one, that's okay. You can get mine. I have made thousands and thousands of loaves of bread using this starter, and hundreds of other people are now using it to make their bread too, and I'll link that below for you. So this is all you need to make amazing sourdough bread at home. Your high protein bread flour, your salt, your water, and a really good sourdough starter. Let's move on to the equipment that you're gonna need to make sourdough. Now friends, there is a lot of sourdough stuff that you can buy, but the truth is that you probably don't need most of it. So I'm gonna show you what you really need to bake a successful loaf of sourdough bread. Now the first thing is a scale. I like this scale, but if you have a scale, use the one that you have. They're available everywhere. Just make sure that your scale can handle the weight capacity of what you're making. So I had a little scale that was a lot less expensive. This one's like $45. And when I added the flour and the water into my bowl, it couldn't handle that much weight and it would just shut off. So make sure you have a scale that can handle the weight that you need. You do need a scale. That's really important. The next thing you're gonna need is a Dutch oven. Now this is one I got on clearance at Target. So just make sure that you have a Dutch oven. If you don't already have one, check Walmart, Target, Home Goods, TJ Maxx, places like that always have Dutch ovens. The other thing that you don't have to have but is really nice to have is a proofing basket, also called a banneton. If you don't have one of these, you can use a bowl lined with a liberally floured tea towel. You want to make sure you don't use a towel that's like fluffy so that lint comes off of it. So just a tea towel and really liberally flour it. And then you're going to need something to score your bread. This is a really sharp bread lom. If you don't have one of these, you could just use a razor blade or a really sharp knife, but it needs to be sharp. And I have found that using a sharp knife kind of leaves like serrated edges in my dough, and I don't get as good of an ear or a belly. So I really like using a bread lom. You do not need a $40 or $50 bread lom. You can get these for $10. And then the last thing that you are gonna need is some parchment paper. I like these unbleached natural parchment sheets. We need this to load our dough into our hot Dutch oven, okay? So you're gonna need some parchment paper, and that is all the equipment that you really need. Okay, let's get started making our sourdough, because the sooner that we make it, the sooner we can eat it. So we're gonna start with what's called the Autolyse, and the Autolyse is when we combine just our flour and our water, not our starter and our salt. So hold off on the starter and the salt. Let's just set those aside for a little bit. I'm gonna take 500 grams of my bread flour here, pour it right into my bowl. And then I've got 350 grams of water that I'm gonna pour right in there. And don't worry, we're gonna add our starter and our salt later. And then we're gonna get in here with our hands and we're gonna start mixing it. Friends, sourdough is just a messy thing, so you kind of have to just go with it. So I'm gonna get in and I'm gonna start combining this flour and water. Now, if you want the recipe that I'm using today, this is my beginner sourdough recipe. I formulated it specifically for beginners to make it easy for newer bakers. I'm gonna have that down below in the description. So if you wanna follow along with that recipe, it's gonna be down below. What I'm doing here is just using my hand to mix the flour in the water. Now this is called the Autolyse, and what's happening here is that the flour is going to start getting hydrated with our water. Okay, so I'm going to mix this together. It's going to be a little bit of a shaggy dough. That's totally normal. And after we've fully combined this, I will cover it and let it sit for 30 minutes. That is it. And then I will add my starter and my salt. Now this is going to start hydrating the flour, but it's also going to start developing the gluten. And what this process does is it makes your dough so much easier to handle later on in the process. So if you're a newer sourdough baker, and if you've maybe baked bread using commercial yeast, you're going to find that sourdough can be a little bit more difficult to handle. It's going to be stickier and just harder to handle. But when you do this Autolyse, it actually makes the dough a lot easier to handle later on, okay? Like I said, it's going to look like a shaggy dough. That's totally normal because we're going to mix this again once we add our starter and our salt. So it's okay for it to be a little bit shaggy. So I have finished mixing my flour and my water. That's the Autolyse. I'm going to cover this dough and let it sit for 30 minutes, and then we'll come back and we'll add our starter and our salt. Okay, our dough's been sitting for about 30 minutes, and now I'm going to add my starter and my salt. So I have 100 grams of my active sourdough starter here. Just going to pour this right over the top of the dough. And then I'm going to add my salt. Now I'm using 10 grams of salt. I'm going to sprinkle that right over the top. Now this might be different from how you've done it previously if you've made sourdough bread before. Some people will add the starter with the flour and water and then add the salt later. I like to do the Autolyse method because, like I said, I think it makes the dough a lot easier to handle, especially for new bakers. Now I'm getting my hand wet just in a bowl of water here. It just makes everything stick a little bit less. And I'm going to do what's called a dimpling motion. I'm going to take my hands and I'm just going to squeeze in this sourdough starter and salt. Now, it is not easy to incorporate all of this. You might be thinking like, how are you ever going to get that starter mixed in with the dough? But I promise you, you will get the starter and the salt mixed in. You just have to have a little bit of patience, which is actually a good thing because we want to do a long initial mix on this dough. And when I say a long mix, what I mean is like 5 to 7 minutes of aggressive mixing is really what we want to do at this stage. Why? Because we really want to start developing that gluten. Gluten is kind of like the glue that keeps your bread together. Okay, that's sort of how I look at it. And we want a strong gluten. And the way you develop a strong gluten is by doing a really strong initial mix here in the beginning. So you can actually see that my starter is starting to get incorporated along with my salt. And I'm just going to keep pinching and kind of twisting this. And then once I feel like it's mixed in pretty well, I'm going to switch techniques and start doing a different mixing technique. So we're almost there. On the day you make your sourdough, you can skip your arm workout because you're going to get a workout from this. I'm going to switch my mixing method, and what I'm going to do here is kind of like a slapping method. I'm going to cup my hand and I'm going to take the dough and I'm actually going to push the dough against the side of the bowl. So let me show you how I do that. It's sort of a slapping. And what this is doing is really developing the gluten in my dough. And I'm just turning my bowl as I do this. And it's really going to transform the dough. You'll see when we're done mixing what the dough looks like, and it's going to look totally different from when we started. All right, I'm going to keep mixing. We'll come back in a minute so you can see how this looks. Okay, our dough has been sitting for 30 minutes, and now we're going to start stretch and folds. Now, if you've ever made bread using traditional commercial yeast like from the grocery store, instant or active dry yeast, this is the point where you would be doing, like you would be kneading your dough. In sourdough, we don't knead our dough because it's a little bit too aggressive and it will actually cause the dough to deflate. All the gas that we're building up through the bulk fermentation process, the dough would deflate, and we don't want that. So instead of kneading our dough, we do something called stretch and folds. And I'm going to show you how I do those right now. So I have a little bowl of water next to me. I'm going to dip my hands in this water, and that'll just make the dough less sticky. And then I'm going to reach into my bowl. I'm going to reach down, grab the dough. I'm going to pull it up. So I'm stretching it, and then I'm going to fold it in towards me. That's called a stretch and fold. Then I'll turn my bowl a quarter of a turn and do the same thing. reach down, grab the dough, stretch it up, and fold it in towards me. Turn the bowl a quarter turn again, pull it up, stretch it over, and then one more time, pull it up and stretch it over. Now, that is called one round of stretch and folds. I went around the bowl and actually stretched it 4 times. That was one round of stretch and folds. We're gonna cover this, let it rest for 30 minutes, and then we're gonna repeat this process 3 times so that you'll do a total of 4 rounds of stretch and folds. Now, this dough is gonna transform by the 4th round of stretch and folds. It will look totally different than it does right now because this is how we're strengthening the gluten. So we're gonna cover it, let it sit for 30 minutes, and then we'll come back. Now I'm gonna come back when I'm on my 4th round of stretch and folds so you can see what the dough looks like at the last round of stretch and folds. So come on back. All right, I just finished the 4th and final round of stretch and folds, and I wanna show you how amazing this dough looks. You can see the dough has completely transformed from the stretch and folds. It went from kind of shaggy and sticky to smooth and strong. This is a very strong dough. I've built up the gluten really, really nicely, and now I'm done with all my stretch and folds. So I'm gonna leave this in the bowl. I'm gonna put the cover on it. I'm actually using just a plastic shower cap. Cover goes on, and then I'm gonna let this sit on my counter and bulk ferment for anywhere from 3 to 6 hours. You'll know that bulk fermentation is done when you see these signs in your dough. You wanna look for a domed top, almost like a little muffin top where it kind of looks like the dough is rising. Your dough should be puffy and jiggly, so if I give this container a shake, you should see the whole mass of dough moving, and it's gonna pull away from the sides of the container, so you can see it's coming away from the sides of my container, and it's light and airy. And I explain this as it's light and airy, kind of like a giant marshmallow. That is what you're going for when you know that bulk fermentation is done. Now, depending on how warm your dough is and the temperature of your house, this can take anywhere from 3 to 8 hours. So this dough has been here for about 4 hours, and I think that bulk fermentation is done. So we're gonna move on to shaping. If you're enjoying this video so far, make sure to hit subscribe so you don't miss any future sourdough tutorials. And if you need a little more help, I've got my beginner sourdough guide linked below, and it's got all the information that you need to make a great loaf of sourdough, including the recipe that we're using today. Okay, now that bulk fermentation is done, it's time to shape our dough, and we're gonna do this in 2 steps. First is gonna be the pre-shape, and then we're gonna do the final shape. So let me show you how I do my pre-shape. I've got my dough here, bulk fermentation is done. I'm just gonna take the dough out of the bowl and put it on my work surface. I got my hand wet so that it makes the dough a little bit less likely to stick to me, so it's not quite as messy. All right, so there is my dough. I'm going to take my dough scraper here. Now, I love this dough scraper because I love the straight edge here and then the rounded edges here. It doesn't hurt my hand the way other dough scrapers did, so I really like this one. I'm gonna get my dough scraper a little bit wet. That will make it non-stick, and then I'm gonna start the pre-shaping of this dough. I'm just gonna take my dough scraper and I'm gonna push the dough down and underneath itself, and I'm gonna go all the way around the loaf. That's what I'm gonna start with. I'm gonna use my other hand as a guide. Let me show you how I do that. So I'm pushing down and into itself to just sort of shape it into a round. And now I'm gonna take my dough scraper and I'm gonna go around the dough in a counterclockwise motion from hip to 12 o'clock, okay? So this is where my hip is, and I'm gonna move this all the way up to 12 o'clock, and I'm gonna be using my other hand to guide the dough. So let me show you how I do that. And I'm just forming the dough into a nice round. You can actually see all these great bubbles that we've got on the dough here. So we had a great bulk fermentation. The dough is alive. And that is it. I am done with the pre-shape. Now you can overdo this. If I keep going like this, you're gonna see that I will eventually start to get little tears in the surface of the dough, and that's what we don't want. So once you have it in a nice round shape, you wanna just leave it alone. And I'm gonna leave this sitting here on my counter uncovered for about 15 minutes. The reason why I'm not covering it is because I actually want the dough to form a light skin. That way when I come back for my final shaping and I flip this dough over onto the counter, it won't stick because the surface will have a light skin and it'll be non-stick. So let's leave this here for 15 minutes and then we'll come back and do our final shaping. All right, our dough's been sitting for about 15 minutes and the pre-shape is done, and now we're gonna move on to final shaping. Now, because I let this sit here and it was uncovered, you can see it's not sticking at all, right? Now sourdough is always gonna be a little bit sticky, but when we let it sit like this, we've actually filmed a light skin on the dough, so it's really not gonna be too sticky. So when I flip this over, I'm gonna be able to pre-shape it without it sticking to my counter. And you'll see, I'm not gonna be putting any flour or water on this counter. I'm just gonna flip my dough right over, all right? So let's do that. And there we go. And my dough is not sticking to my counter at all. That's the trick, and that's the reason why we let our dough sit for 15 minutes uncovered. It just makes it easier to do this final shaping. Now, I'm stretching out my dough just slightly here. When we do our final shaping, we want to build surface tension in the dough, and we want to shape it tightly. This way, when we bake it in the oven, it's going to get a nice oven spring and puff up, which is what we want. And you need some surface tension in order to do that, but you don't want to be too rough with your dough, because throughout this bulk fermentation process, we've built up the gases in the dough, and we don't want to deflate those. So I'm going to do what's called the letter fold shaping method. So I've stretched out my dough just a little bit, and I'm going to fold it up just like if I was folding a letter. I'm going to take the bottom third, fold it up to the middle, and then I'm going to take the top third and do the exact same thing and fold it down to the middle, okay? Just like I'm folding a letter that I'm going to put in an envelope. And now I'm going to rotate my dough, and I'm just going to roll it up. Now, while I'm rolling it, I'm pressing firmly, but I'm not smashing it down. So you'll see I'm rolling it tightly, but still being a little bit gentle with it. I don't want to smash all the air I just put into my dough through bulk fermentation. That is it. Now I'm going to pinch the sides, and there you go. My loaf, you can see it a little bit better here, is done being shaped. Now, I've got my proofing basket here. This is just a Banneton basket, and I'm gonna put my dough in the basket with the seam side up. So here we go. I'm gonna flip it over and put it into my basket with the seam side up. And now I am done with the final shaping. Okay, we've finished shaping our dough, and now we're ready to move on to the next step, which is the cold ferment or the cold proof. You might have heard it referred to both ways. I've got my shaped dough in my proofing basket. I'm gonna cover it, and now this is the easiest part of the entire sourdough process. All I'm gonna do is put my loaf in the refrigerator for 8 to 18 hours. Now, this is where the magic happens. The flavor is developed in your bread when it's in the refrigerator doing that cold ferment. If you don't have to skip this step, I really encourage you not to skip it. The cold ferment develops flavor, and it's really gonna make your bread taste a lot better. It's also gonna make it easier when we move on to scoring. It's easier to score a loaf that's cold than to score warm dough. So this is also another great way to fit sourdough into your schedule. It's about 2 o'clock right now, and I don't need bread today, but if I put this in my refrigerator, I can take it out tomorrow at about 4 o'clock, bake it, and I will have warm, fresh bread on my dinner table by 5 o'clock tomorrow night. So this really helps sourdough to fit in your schedule, and it develops a great flavor. So don't skip the cold ferment. I'm gonna put this in the fridge, and then I will see you back here tomorrow when we bake up our loaf. All right, it's the best part of the process. It's time to bake our bread, yay! So I've got my Dutch oven here. It's very hot. I've preheated my Dutch oven in my oven at 450 degrees for 45 minutes. So I've got a really hot Dutch oven and a really hot oven, all right? So let me move this over because I'm gonna show you how to score your bread, and then we're gonna load it into our Dutch oven. I've got my parchment paper here. I'm gonna show you a little pro tip. All right, we crumpled up our parchment paper. And the reason why we do that is so that we don't get any of these weird divots in the bottom of our bread when we actually bake it. If you don't crumple it up, you'll get all these weird divots in your bread when you bake it. So here's my bread. I just took it out of the refrigerator, so it's nice and cold. I'm not gonna let it sit on the counter. Once you take it out of that refrigerator, you wanna score it and get it in your Dutch oven, okay? I'm gonna take my parchment paper and there we go. Flip my dough over, looking great. And now we're gonna score our bread. Now you need to score your sourdough bread. As this bakes, the water that's in the loaf is gonna create steam. That's what's gonna cause the loaf to rise up. They call that oven spring. And that's a good thing. You want a tall, fluffy loaf, right? Not a sad, flat Frisbee or UFO. But in order to make sure that the steam has an area to escape, we're gonna score our bread. If we don't score it, the crust will actually tear because the steam is gonna find a place to escape. Now, you're gonna need a bread lahm for that. I'm using this one. It's pretty inexpensive. I think it's like $9 or $10, but it needs to be very sharp. If you don't have one of these, you can use just a razor blade or a really sharp knife, although I do think that a bread lom is the way to go. And when we score our dough, we're gonna start at the top of the loaf and score straight down to the bottom, okay? So from the top of the loaf on the surface to the bottom, I'm gonna hold my bread lom at a slight angle, and I'm gonna be quick and confident and score in one motion. You don't wanna do this sawing motion. You wanna get in there and don't be afraid to do it. Just give it one good, quick and confident score. And I'm gonna score about a 1/2 inch deep, okay? There we go, that's it. Now once you score your bread, you wanna get it right into the Dutch oven and then into the oven, okay? So I'm gonna load this using the parchment paper very carefully into my hot Dutch oven. Trust me, I've burned myself more than once and I don't wanna do that again. You can probably see all the burn marks on my arms. I've got my dough in my Dutch oven. You can see where I scored it. I'm gonna put the lid on and then I'm gonna bake this in my oven at 450 degrees for 20 minutes with the lid on. And then I'm gonna remove the lid and bake it for another about 20 minutes until the internal temperature of the dough is 205 to 210 degrees. That'll let me know that my bread is fully baked. So into the oven we go for 20 minutes and then 20 minutes with the lid off, and I'll see you back here. All right, our bread has been baking for 40 minutes. Let's take it out and see what we've got. All right. We have a beautiful loaf of sourdough bread. Now, one quick tip. Make sure as soon as you finish baking your bread that you take it out of the Dutch oven and put it on a cooling rack. Otherwise, sometimes the parchment paper will actually stick to the bread. So let's take that off right now. And there you go. We've got a beautiful loaf of sourdough bread. Take a look at that. Did you know that you're supposed to let your bread sit for about an hour before you cut into it? This is because your bread is actually still baking, and if you cut into it too soon, you could end up with a gummy loaf. So I know it's hard to resist, but try to let it sit for at least 30 or 45 minutes before you cut into it. All right, our bread has been sitting for about 35 minutes. I really should let it sit longer, but I love warm sourdough, so I'm gonna cut into it anyways. And whenever I don't cut into the loaves and show you what they look like, people get upset. So I'm gonna cut into it and show you what this loaf looks like. Ooh, do you hear that crust? It sounds so good. We have a beautiful loaf of sourdough bread, perfect for beginners. You can make this. And that's it, perfect sourdough at home without the stress. But here's the thing, even though I've made thousands of loaves, there are some tiny changes I've made over the years that have made a huge difference in how my bread turns out. Things like a better crust, a bigger rise, and more flavor. So watch this video right here, 10 tiny changes that will massively improve your sourdough, where I show you what they are, how they work, and how you can start using them to instantly level up your bread. You're gonna love it, and I'll see you there.